Horror is a genre that has many ups and downs, just like every other genre. Many highs and very, very low lows. But the thing about horror is that when it's at its best, in my opinion, it's not trying to scare you. Well, what does that mean? I think that horror has great potential to be a psychological analysis of what it means to be a human. Good horror delves deep into the human conscience. It goes into what our virtues are, what our vices are, the things that scare us, and how we as humans can conquer the darkness with light. Good horror makes you care about what a character does. It makes you genuinely concerned for the choices that a person makes as a moral actor. Horror is not just about scary monsters and dark corners that you can't see. Although that's important for the genre, horror is ultimately about the human struggle versus evil. Today, I want to talk vaguely, without giving any spoilers, about two examples of horror when it's at its best, and I want to show you why horror is not something to be afraid of. Now, I wanted to talk about something like Hereditary or Alien, but I figured there's so much stuff online talking about these movies, an endless number of great videos better than this one talking about those movies. So I wanted to do something a little more obscure, talking about a film. The Wailing is a South Korean horror movie that is absolutely brilliant. You can find it online, it's on Netflix or something, and it's really, really good. The underlying premise is incredibly basic. There's a demon going around a town and they're trying to stop it. That's basically it. And you've seen that in horror movies a million times. What makes The Wailing special is not that underlying premise, but what it does surrounding that premise. What makes it special is how the characters are developed, how the setting is portrayed, and the actions that the characters take. It's brilliant in the way that it sets up expectations, makes you think that those expectations are going to be fulfilled, rips the rug out from under you, and then makes you second guess yourself thinking, well, was I wrong? Or, no, it looks like this is going to happen. And then it makes you think you're right, and then it does it again. And that's good storytelling. Maybe not in every story, but that's good storytelling, and The Wailing does it really great. So again, without spoiling anything, fundamentally what happens in this film is you follow a main character who's a police officer trying to solve a string of crimes and other related incidents that we find out are ultimately due to a demonic influence, to a demonic creature. Now, we all know that when someone is undergoing a tremendous amount of stress, anxiety, and fear, that even the most resilient people are liable to do unreasonable things to secure their own safety. And because we're human, this is something that we can empathize with. We see the person who's been overworked, whose home life is falling apart, and who doesn't see any purpose in life anymore. And we've seen this person try to claw their way to safety. And in doing that, we've seen this person hurt people around them. In real life, we've seen this. We've seen this person hurt people around them and hurt themselves and make things even worse, all in the pursuit of the security that they're so lacking. And because we're human, this is something we can empathize with, and at the same time recognize that it would be better if it weren't that way. We can look at someone who's buckling under pressure and empathize with them and try and help them, and still acknowledge that this person over here who's struggling with pressure, who isn't buckling, and not because they're hiding anything, not because they're pushing it all down, but because there's something within them that's giving them the strength to hold up this burden, we understand that it's better if we were all like this person. And so when we watch The Wailing, we're confronted over and over again. We're put in this uncomfortable situation where we have to watch these characters do things that are morally questionable, but that we can outright condemn as morally wrong at times. And yet, we understand why they're doing it. It's a brilliant display of writing, and this film ultimately, despite the demons, despite the scares, despite the anxiety, despite the fact that it's creating tension constantly to make you uncomfortable as a viewer, this film is ultimately a film about humanity. It's ultimately about how humans are to respond in the face of tremendous stress, of loss, and of grief. And so this film, despite the fact that it's filled with demons, that it spends almost every second trying to build up tension and make you uneasy, is ultimately about the human struggle with the self. It's ultimately about how one faces these struggles, how one can try and bear the struggles without destroying everything around them. How, despite the fact that it's a noble task to try and save those people around you, that if to fight tyranny we stoop to the level of tyranny ourselves, then we've done something wrong and our ends do not justify those means. That in fighting darkness, if we delve into the darkness ourselves, something seriously wrong has taken place. And this is a fundamentally religious message in this film. Now, I'm not saying that this is a religious movie, but I'm saying that this is a movie right here where the message of the film, doesn't mean you have to like the film, is something that's intrinsically human positive, at least if you interpret it in the way that I'm interpreting it. And this is a through line, in my opinion, of many good horror films, horror books, and horror games. The focus on humanity and how humanity works and how humanity can be better is the ultimate focus of good horror. Now that we've gone through our first example, I want to say none of this is to say that any of this stuff that I'm saying means that any of your, I guess you could say, lowbrow horror, slasher films, or whatever else are intrinsically irredeemable and that you shouldn't watch them or something like that, just because they don't ultimately always have a message about, human perseverance, and they're not always this psychoanalytical thing. It doesn't mean that. Sometimes lowbrow, if you will, media is rather fun, and you don't always need to be on the edge of your seat when you watch or read or play something in order for that thing to bring enjoyment into your life, and that's perfectly valid. However, it reminds me of, if you take, let's say, Lord of the Rings and compare it to your favorite fantasy book that you picked out at the book fair when you were in 5th grade. Well, that book that you read in 5th grade might have been a legitimately fun book, and it might even be a good book, but I think everybody can agree that it probably doesn't compare to the masterpiece, which is Lord of the Rings, in the way that it comments on religious natures, and the way that it comments on humanity and its world building and its storytelling, so on. That 5th grade book might be really good, and it might even be really good for you to read as an adult. It might just be good fun and might have something to say. But it doesn't compare on this level, and that's ultimately what this video is about. Now, I want to throw out everything that I said about not wanting to talk about things that other people have talked about a million times, that I said earlier, for this second example. Because I want to talk about one of the most critically acclaimed, talked about horror video games ever made. You can probably find endless content on this online. And that is Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 is one of the greatest video game masterpieces that I've ever played in my life. I've only played through it once, and to this day, I'm still talking about it on a regular basis. And that's even more impressive when you take into account the fact that this game is old, that its controls are outdated, that it doesn't look the prettiest, that it's clunky, that it's got bad voice acting most of the time, if not all of the time. Take all of these things into account, and it's still one of the greatest video games I've ever played in my life. Why? Well, the reason for that's pretty simple. Despite the clunk, despite the outdated mechanics, despite all of these things, it's one of the greatest narratives that I've ever seen portrayed on a video game. Silent Hill 2 is scary, and it's scary because of its weird monsters and its dark corridors, its rusted metal everywhere, and its inhuman soundtrack and sound effects. That is why it's scary. But more than that, Silent Hill 2 is scary in the way that baring your heart to another person is scary. Silent Hill 2 is scary in the way that when you are vulnerable with another person, when you tell them everything about you, when you give them your deepest thoughts and secrets, that they can take those thoughts and secrets and sharpen them into a knife with which to stab you in the back. That's the ultimate way that Silent Hill 2 is scary. Silent Hill 2 is like watching a dramatized, surreal version of a long therapy session. And that is what makes this game so brilliant. Couched behind what are ultimately distractions in the enemy monsters, this is a game that is ultimately about grief, about loss, about vice, about our darkest desires and secrets, the failures of our past, the consequences of those failures, how we cope with them, so on. That is ultimately what Silent Hill 2 is about, past the horror stuff, past the obvious horror stuff. That's what it's about. Now, I'm not gonna, again, spoil it, even though the game's pretty old at this point, partially because we've got a remake coming out sooner than later, but that's what this game is about. The ultimate element of Silent Hill 2's narrative is loss. The incredible destructive power of loss. How loss can turn us into shells of ourselves, especially when it's the loss of dearly beloved, close people in our lives. It's about how to cope with that loss. It's about how to come to terms with that loss. And it's about how to integrate that loss into your current person. That is one of the things, that is the thing, in my opinion, the narrative that makes this game so great. And again, that's putting into context that this game is outdated. It's not pretty. Well, it's kind of pretty in a weird way, but it's not pretty if you compare it to a modern game in 4K, 60 FPS, 120 FPS with, these high resolution textures and all this other stuff. It's not pretty in that way. It's clunky. The combat is weird. It's not good. At least it doesn't feel satisfying, let's say. And yet, despite all of that, it's a game that I was absolutely captivated by for the entire runtime of it. And like I said, we've got a remake of Silent Hill 2 coming out sooner than later, so I hope that that will be able to really do the original justice, and I hope that in doing that, it can bring people who have never played the original Silent Hill 2 into this world. Whether they haven't played it because they've just never heard of it, or they've never gotten around to it, or whether they've never played it because, the game's old and clunky. Whatever the reason is, I hope that this remake brings people into this world, and I hope it does it well, because it's genuinely tremendous. Now, why did I make this video? Despite what the title says, this video is for everybody. But ultimately, as a Christian myself, I see a lot of Christians online who quickly denounce horror media as intrinsically bad, as demonic, or as glorifying evil, or all kinds of other things. Many Christians, at least online, seem to say that horror is something that a person with a well-formed conscience, especially a person of faith, should never engage with. Well, I just don't think that's true. And so I made this video with these two specific examples to highlight the great beauty that horror can display, and it can display it in this way that, despite often being unrealistic with big, grotesque monsters, horror is sometimes more realistic than other genres, because in order to get to that beauty, and not every piece of horror is beautiful in this way, of course, but to get to that beauty, you have to scrape off a thick layer of grime and dirt. And it's very much like real life, because life is not like a Hallmark movie at all times. Sometimes you're in periods of life where it's really, really good, but that's not always how it goes. Oftentimes life is hard, it's depressing, it feels like everything is too much to bear and you just can't do it anymore. And that is one of the beauties of horror, is that it can relate to this, it can anthropomorphize, if you will, this darkness of life in the monster, right? In the darkness that you can't see through. It can turn this truth of reality into this tangible, oppressive thing that chases you down. And yet through that, good horror will often take that as a time to tell us a truth about humanity. That's why I think horror is good. Now that doesn't mean that you have to like it. It certainly doesn't mean that every piece of horror media out there is good. As a matter of fact, I think a lot of the criticisms that Christian people make about certain horror movies are perfectly valid. Because even if a lot of them aren't demonic, let's say, a lot of them do glorify evil, or they, mock a Christian value or a religious aspect like nuns or something just for a quick scare, let's say. And a lot of it's just lowbrow trash. That's true. But there's good in there, and there's a lot of good. And I think that it's a genre that we don't want to unnecessarily overlook by sweeping generalizations that ultimately ring hollow. If you don't like it, that's totally fine. But I think that there's a lot of good here. So thank you guys for watching. I'm Marcus Hill. This is my first video. I hope you guys like it. I plan on making more in the future, hopefully on a regular basis. Thank you guys. God bless.